The warm summer evening in London was slowly turning into night as James Thompson, a 23-year-old recent graduate from Manchester University, stumbled along the historic streets with his three best friends. Their loud laughter echoed off the old buildings as they made their way through the city, leaving a trail of empty pubs behind them. James's dark hair was messy, his blue shirt had a fresh beer stain, and his eyes couldn't quite focus on anything for too long. "Best graduation celebration ever," James shouted, throwing his arm around his childhood friend, Mike, who was trying his best to keep James walking in a straight line. The group had started their pub crawl at noon, determined to visit every famous pub in central London. Now, 8 hours and countless pints later, James could barely remember how many places they'd visited. Their unplanned route through London had taken them past Big Ben, through Trafalgar Square, and now, by pure chance, they found themselves approaching the grand gates of Buckingham Palace. The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink, casting a magical glow on the palace's cream-colored walls. Despite the late hour, tourists still crowded the area, taking photos and pointing at the magnificent building. "Mate, look at that." Tom, another friend in the group, pointed toward one of the Queen's guards, standing perfectly still at his post. The guard wore the famous red uniform and tall black bearskin hat, standing straight as an arrow with his rifle positioned precisely against his shoulder. He looked like a living statue, his face showing no emotion as tourists posed for pictures near him. James stopped walking and stared at the guard, his alcohol-fuzzy brain struggling to process the scene. The guard's uniform seemed to shine in the evening light, every button polished to perfection. The rifle in his hands caught James's attention particularly. It looked just like the ones he used to play with in video games. "Those are real rifles they carry, right?" James asked, his words slightly slurred. He took another sip from the water bottle they'd filled with beer at the last pub, his balance swaying slightly. "Yeah, but they're not allowed to move or react to anything," said Pete, the most sober of the group. "It's part of their training. They just stand there no matter what happens." A group of American tourists nearby were taking selfies with the guard in the background, making funny faces and poses. The guard remained motionless, staring straight ahead as if the tourists didn't exist. James watched this with growing interest, his intoxicated mind starting to form what he would later realize was a terribly stupid idea. "You know what would be absolutely mental?" James said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "What if someone actually tried to touch his gun? Like, has anyone ever done that?" Mike grabbed James's shoulder, suddenly concerned about his friend's train of thought. "Don't even think about it, mate. Those guards are real soldiers, not tourist attractions." But James wasn't listening anymore. The combination of alcohol, excitement, and the desire to do something memorable on his graduation day was creating a dangerous mixture in his mind. He took another long drink from his beer-filled water bottle, his eyes fixed on the guard's rifle. A cool evening breeze blew through the area, making the guard's red uniform jacket sway slightly. To James's intoxicated eyes, the scene seemed almost unreal, like something from a movie or a video game. The guard continued his statue-like stance, but his eyes were alert, constantly scanning his surroundings as part of his training. "I bet I could make him move," James mumbled, more to himself than to his friends. The alcohol in his system had completely erased his common sense, replacing it with a false sense of invincibility that would soon lead to one of the biggest mistakes of his life. His friends exchanged worried looks as they noticed James's attention becoming more and more focused on the guard. The sun had almost completely set now, and the palace grounds were being lit by the warm glow of traditional lampposts. None of them realized that these last few moments of their carefree celebration were about to turn into a night they would never forget, for all the wrong reasons. Mike pulled out his phone and started scrolling through TikTok, trying to distract James from his dangerous fascination with the Queen's Guard. Instead, this only made things worse. "Look at this video, mate," Mike said, showing James a clip of tourists posing next to different guards at the palace. "These videos get millions of views. Some bloke just standing there got famous for doing a silly dance." The screen's blue light illuminated James's face as he watched the video with intense focus, despite his blurry vision. More tourists walked past them, some taking photos, others pointing and whispering about the guard's impressive stance. The evening air had grown cooler, but James didn't notice. The alcohol in his system kept him warm, and his mind was racing with ideas. "That's nothing," James scoffed, pushing the phone away. Anyone can take a stupid picture. We need to do something epic, something that'll actually go viral. He pulled out his own phone, opening Instagram with fumbling fingers. We got almost no followers. After tonight, that's gonna change. Pete stepped forward, placing himself between James and the guard. Come on, mate. Let's get some food instead. I know a great kebab shop just around the corner. You could see the dangerous glint in James's eyes, the same look he'd had in university right before getting into trouble. But James wasn't listening. He watched as a young couple posed near the guard, taking selfies and giggling. The guard remained perfectly still, his face expressionless, the rifle held precisely against his shoulder. The weapon's metal parts caught the light from nearby lampposts, seeming to wink at James. You know what would be absolutely legendary? James said, his words running together slightly. If I just walked up there and grabbed that rifle, just for a second. Think about how many views that would get. He pulled out his water bottle, finishing the last of the beer inside with a long gulp. Tom grabbed James's arm, his face serious despite his own intoxication. Are you mental? Those rifles are real, and those guards are actual soldiers. They're not some Disney attraction. Exactly, James said, too loudly, causing a few tourists to turn and stare. That's why it would be epic. Nobody's ever done it before. We could make a fortune from the video. The alcohol had created a barrier between his brain and common sense, making the terrible idea seem brilliant. Mike tried a different approach. Mate, you just graduated. You got that job interview next week at that fancy accounting firm. You don't want to mess that up, right? He hoped mentioning James's future might break through the alcoholic haze. For a moment, it seemed to work. James paused, swaying slightly as he stood there. But then a group of teenagers nearby burst into laughter at something on their phones, and his attention snapped back to his misguided plan. The interview's not important. This could make us proper famous. We wouldn't even need jobs. Pete pulled out his phone, pretending to check the time. It's getting late anyway. The last train to Manchester leaves in an hour. We should head back. This was a lie. The train ran all night. But he was desperate to get James away from the palace. You lot are boring, James declared, his voice carrying the distinctive whine of a drunk person who isn't getting his way. Back at uni, you were always up for a laugh. Now you're acting like my dad. He straightened up, trying to look more sober than he was, and adjusted his wrinkled shirt. The guard stood just 30 yards away, still as a statue, but his eyes had noticed the commotion. Years of training had taught him to spot potential trouble while maintaining his ceremonial stance. As the evening lights cast long shadows across the palace grounds, he could see James's group clearly, recognizing the familiar signs of a situation about to go wrong. James's friends formed a loose circle around him, trying one last time to talk sense into him. But they could see his jaw was set, his eyes focused on the guard with drunk determination. The next few minutes would change all their lives forever, though none of them knew it yet. Before any of his friends could grab him, James suddenly pushed through their circle and stumbled forward. The movement was so unexpected that Mike nearly dropped his phone, and Pete lost his balance trying to reach for James's shirt. The evening crowd of tourists parted instinctively, creating an unintentional path between James and the guard. Private William Matthews, standing perfectly still at his post, had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 3 years. In that time, he had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable: silly poses, funny faces, attempted conversations. Something about this situation felt different. Through his peripheral vision, he could see James's unsteady approach, and his military training immediately began assessing the threat level. James, get back here. Mike's urgent whisper carried across the courtyard, but James acted as if he couldn't hear it. His feet scraped against the pavement as he walked, unable to lift them properly in his drunken state. The tourists who had been taking photos near the guard quickly stepped aside, sensing the tension in the air. The evening lights around Buckingham Palace created strange shadows that seemed to dance around James as he moved forward. His face wore a sloppy grin, but his eyes held a determined look that worried the few people who could see it clearly. A young mother hurriedly pulled her children back, instinctively protecting them from whatever was about to happen. Private Matthews kept his eyes forward, as required by his training, but every sense was on high alert. He could hear James's uneven footsteps getting closer, could smell the strong scent of alcohol as the distance between them decreased. His hands maintained their perfect grip on his rifle, but his muscles tensed imperceptibly, ready to react if necessary. Tom pulled out his phone, but not to record. His fingers hovered over the emergency numbers. Pete had started walking parallel to James, trying to get ahead of him to cut him off, but the crowd of onlookers made it difficult to move quickly. Mike stood frozen, his face pale as he watched his best friend approach the guard. "This is gonna be epic," James announced to no one in particular, his voice too loud in the growing tension. A group of American tourists had stopped taking selfies and were now watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Someone in the crowd started recording with their phone, sensing that something newsworthy was about to happen. The evening air had grown colder, but James didn't notice. The alcohol in his system had convinced him that he was about to become famous, that this moment would change his life. He had no idea how right he was about the second part, though not in the way he imagined. Private Matthews could now see James clearly in his peripheral vision. The guard's training ran through his mind automatically. Assess the threat, maintain composure, prepare for engagement only if necessary. His eyes remained fixed ahead, but his other senses tracked James's every movement. Years of military discipline kept him statue still, but every muscle was ready to respond in an instant. The distance between James and the guard had shrunk to just a few meters now. The crowd had grown larger as people stopped to watch, creating an impromptu audience for what they probably thought would be just another tourist prank. A few people had their phones out, recording the scene, unaware that they were about to capture something much more serious than they expected. James's footsteps grew louder as he got closer. His friends had stopped trying to call him back, realizing it was too late. The only sounds now were the whispers of the crowd, the distant London traffic, and James's scuffing shoes on the pavement. The next few seconds would transform this quiet evening into something that would be talked about in London pubs for years to come. Time seemed to slow down as James reached the guard. He was close enough now to see the perfect stitching on Private Matthews' red uniform, the gleam of his polished buttons, and the well-oiled metal of the rifle. The crowd held their collective breath, phones recording what they thought would be just another tourist's foolish attempt to make a guard smile. James's alcohol-soaked brain took one last moment to appreciate his surrounding audience. "Watch this," he slurred to a nearby teenage tourist, who took a step back in response. The strong smell of beer followed James's movements as he swayed slightly, trying to maintain his balance on legs that felt increasingly unreliable. Private Matthews remained motionless, but his highly trained senses were tracking every detail. He could hear James's heavy breathing, smell the alcohol, and see the young man's unfocused eyes in his peripheral vision. His fingers maintained their ceremonial grip on the rifle, but his muscles were coiled like springs, ready to react in an instant. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. James, with all the grace of a drunken giraffe, suddenly lunged forward. His right hand reached out toward the rifle, fingers spread wide, aiming to grab the weapon's barrel. The movement was clumsy and telegraphed, the kind of action that would have been easy to avoid if this had been a game. But this wasn't a game. The moment James's fingertips brushed against the cold metal of the rifle, Private Matthews exploded into action. Years of military training transformed into pure fluid motion. In one smooth movement, he pivoted the rifle away from James's grasp while simultaneously stepping to the side. His left hand shot out, catching James's wrist in a grip that felt like steel. The crowd gasped. Several phones dropped as their owners jumped in surprise. James's eyes widened as his alcohol-addled brain tried to process what was happening. 1 second, he had been reaching for the rifle. The next, he found himself being expertly maneuvered into a controlled hold that left him completely helpless. "Royal Guard, stand down." Private Matthews' voice boomed across the courtyard, sharp and commanding. It was the first time many of the tourists had ever heard a Queen's Guard speak, and the authority in his voice made several people step back involuntarily. James tried to struggle, but quickly realized it was useless. Private Matthews had him in a hold that was specifically designed to control without causing injury. The guard's training was evident in every precise movement. This was a man who had practiced these defensive maneuvers countless times. Within seconds, the sound of boots on pavement announced the arrival of 2 additional Queen's Guards, moving with practiced precision. Behind them came the rapid footsteps of palace police officers, their radios crackling with activity. The crowd of tourists had grown even larger, their phones still recording as the scene unfolded. It was just a joke." James tried to explain, his words still slurred. The reality of his situation was starting to break through his drunken haze, bringing with it the first waves of regret and fear. His friends stood in the crowd, their faces pale with shock, as they watched their graduation celebration turn into a serious security incident. Private Matthews maintained his professional composure, holding James securely while the police officers approached. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes remained alert, scanning for any additional threats. The rifle, which had been the target of James's foolish attempt, was now safely secured against his shoulder, out of reach. The police officers quickly took control of the situation, professionally restraining James with handcuffs. As they did so, one of them spoke into his radio, subject secured. Attempted weapons grab at gate 3, situation contained. The formal police language made everything feel suddenly very real to James, whose bravado had completely evaporated. The evening air felt much colder now as James was led away. The last thing he saw before being placed in the police van was Private Matthews, already back at his post, standing perfectly still as if nothing had happened. Only now did James understand what his friends had tried to tell him. These weren't tourist attractions in fancy uniforms. These were highly trained soldiers, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The police van's blue lights flashed against the palace walls as it pulled away from Buckingham Palace. Inside, James sat with his head bowed, the cold metal handcuffs around his wrists serving as an undeniable reminder of this foolish decision. The two police officers in the front seat spoke quietly into their radios, using official codes that made everything sound even more serious. At the palace, James's friends stood in a tight group, their faces showing a mixture of shock, worry, and disbelief. Mike was already on the phone with James's parents, trying to explain the situation without causing too much panic. "No, Mrs. Thompson, he's okay, yes, but, I know, the police are taking him to the station now. No, this isn't a joke." The crowd of tourists that had witnessed the incident was slowly dispersing, but their phones were busy uploading videos to social media. Within minutes, clips of James' attempted grab and the guard's swift response were spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. James was about to become famous, but not in the way he had hoped. At the police station in central London, reality hit James like a bucket of cold water. The booking process was methodical and humbling. His shoelaces were removed, his belongings were placed in a clear plastic bag, and his fingerprints were taken. The sergeant behind the desk looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and frustration. "Name?" the sergeant asked, though he already had it from James's ID. "James Thompson," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Age? 23. Occupation? Recent graduate. I was supposed to have a job interview next week." The word was hung heavily in the air. James's head was starting to clear, and with sobriety came the crushing weight of understanding. Every question from the sergeant, every form that was filled out, every photo that was taken, it all made the situation feel more real and more terrible. In a small interview room with bright fluorescent lights, two detectives sat across from James. The room smelled of coffee and sanitizer, and the metal chair felt cold through James's thin shirt. On the table between them lay a form with the words "Attempted Weapons Seizure, Royal Property," printed at the top. "Let's go through this one more time," the female detective said, her voice professional but not unkind. "What exactly were you thinking when you approached the Queen's Guard?" The question made James want to sink through the floor. How could he explain that he hadn't been thinking at all? Meanwhile, his friends waited in the station's lobby. Tom had managed to find a local lawyer who specialized in tourist-related incidents, though the lawyer's first comment after hearing the story wasn't encouraging. "This is significantly more serious than the usual tourist mishap." James's father was already on his way down from Manchester, having left immediately after receiving Mike's call. His mother had called the station 3 times, each time being told politely, but firmly, that she would need to wait until the formal booking process was complete. Back in the interview room, James tried to explain himself through his pounding headache. "I just wanted to make a funny video," he said, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "I didn't think about it being a real weapon, or him being a real soldier." The male detective looked up from his notes. "Mr. Thompson, attempting to disarm a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces is a serious offense. The rifle you tried to grab was a fully functional L85 A3 assault rifle. This isn't about making videos for social media. This is about national security. The words national security echoed in James's mind as he sat in the holding cell later that night. The cell was small and smelled of disinfectant, with a hard bench and a small window set high in the wall. Through it, he could see the night sky over London, the same sky he'd been celebrating under just hours ago. Now, instead of planning his future career in accounting, he was wondering if he would have a criminal record. Instead of thinking about his upcoming job interview, he was thinking about his court appearance. The next morning, James sat in his father's car as they drove back to Manchester in silence. His father, normally talkative and cheerful, hadn't said more than 10 words since paying James's bail. The radio was off, leaving them with only the sound of the highway and their own thoughts. James's head throbbed from his hangover, every pulse a reminder of his stupidity. His phone, returned to him along with his other belongings, wouldn't stop buzzing. News websites had picked up the story, and videos of the incident were going viral. Drunk graduate tries to dura Queen's Guard's rifle, read one headline. Another proclaimed, tourists Royal Guard Kiran Cade goes horror ibili ram. His Instagram followers had indeed increased, just as he wanted, but the comments were far from the admiring ones he'd imagined. Back home, his mother was waiting at the door, her face showing the worry of a sleepless night. She hugged him tightly, then stepped back with tears in her eyes. "What were you thinking, James?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. The local news van parked across the street told him that his hometown already knew about his mistake. The family's landline phone kept ringing. James's father had unplugged it twice, but his mother insisted on keeping it connected in case the lawyer called. Relatives, family friends, and nosy neighbors all wanted to know what had happened. Each time his mother answered, her voice grew more tired as she repeated the same explanation. In his childhood bedroom, James opened his laptop to check his email. The message from the accounting firm about his upcoming job interview was still there, sent just 2 days ago. It felt like it was from another lifetime. With shaking hands, he typed a reply, explaining that he needed to withdraw his application. He knew they would find out anyway. His face was all over the internet. The lawyer called, his father said from the doorway, making James jump. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to James since London. "She says we're lucky. The guard didn't get hurt, you didn't actually touch the rifle, and you have no previous record." He paused, then added, "But it's still serious, James, very serious." The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and shame. James's phone kept showing notifications from news websites using his story. Some focused on the humor. Guard 1, drunk tourist 0, while others took a more serious tone, discussing the increasing problems of tourists disrespecting the Queen's Guards. His face appeared in all of them, captured in dozens of different angles by the crowd's phones. His friends tried to be supportive, sending messages of encouragement, but their group chat, usually buzzing with jokes and plans, had gone quiet. Nobody knew quite what to say. Mike sent a link to a fundraising website where people were collecting money for James' legal fees, but James couldn't bear to look at it. The university called on Thursday. James' graduation ceremony was in 3 weeks, and they wanted to discuss the situation. His mother took the call, listening with a tight face as they talked about reputation and conduct unbecoming. When she hung up, she didn't need to tell James it was bad news. He could see it in her eyes. Local reporters kept trying to get interviews. They called the house, messaged him on social media, and one even approached him at the local supermarket. Each time, James followed his lawyer's advice. No comment. But their questions haunted him. What were you thinking? Did you know it was a real rifle? Do you regret your actions? That last question was the easiest to answer, even if he couldn't say it publicly. Of course he regretted it. He regretted every second of that stupid decision. He regretted not listening to his friends. He regretted drinking so much. He regretted thinking that social media fame was worth risking his future for. On Friday afternoon, a large brown envelope arrived from the court. 3 months after the incident, James sat at his desk in his small Manchester apartment, staring at his laptop screen. The court case had ended weeks ago, but its effects were still very much present in his life. The judge had been surprisingly understanding but firm, a substantial fine of £5,000, 200 hours of community service, and a 2-year ban from approaching any royal property. James had also been required to write a formal letter of apology to Private Matthews and the Queen's Guard. The video of his drunken attempt had reached over 10 million views across different platforms. James hadn't watched it since that first morning after, but he didn't need to. The memory was clear enough now that he was sober. His phone buzzed with a message from Mike. "Hey mate, they want you to speak at that school again. Year 10 assembly next Tuesday. You up for it?" James typed back a quick yes. These school talks had become a regular part of his life, though not in the way he'd imagined when he dreamed of becoming famous. Instead of being a social media star, he had become something different. A cautionary tale about the dangers of alcohol and the quest for internet fame. The local police had actually suggested these talks. After seeing how genuinely remorseful James was, they proposed that he share his experience with young people. At first, it had been humiliating, standing in front of teenagers and admitting his mistake. But over time, James had realized that his story was actually helping people understand the serious consequences of drunk decision-making. His father, who hadn't spoken to him for weeks after the incident, had finally started talking to him again after attending one of these talks. "You're making something good out of this mess," he'd said afterward, putting his hand on James's shoulder for the first time since that night in London. "That's what matters now." The accounting firm job was long gone, of course. No major company wanted to hire someone whose first Google search result showed them trying to grab a guard's rifle at Buckingham Palace. Instead, James had found work at his uncle's small business, doing basic bookkeeping. The pay was less than he'd hoped for with his degree, but it was a start, and his uncle had been one of the few people willing to give him a chance. Opening his email, James found a new message from an anti-alcohol organization. They wanted him to participate in their upcoming campaign about binge drinking. These requests were becoming more frequent. His story had struck a chord with groups trying to promote responsible behavior among young people. James had never planned to become an advocate for responsible drinking, but life had strange ways of working out. His friends still met up regularly, though their nights out were different now. No more pub crawls or drinking games. Instead, they'd found other ways to have fun: sports, movie nights, hiking trips. The incident had changed them all, making them more aware of how quickly things could go wrong. Private Matthews, the guard he tried to disarm, had actually responded to James' apology letter. The response was short but important. "Thank you for taking responsibility for your actions. Learn from this, and help others learn too." James had framed the letter and hung it on his wall, a reminder of both his biggest mistake and his commitment to do better. Social media was still part of his life, but differently now. His follower count had grown because of the incident, but he used his platform to share his story and its lessons. Every time someone commented "legend" or "this is hilarious" on the old video, James would respond with the reality: the court costs, the career impact, the shame, and the stress it had caused his family. Looking out his window at the Manchester evening, James thought about how one drunken moment had completely changed his life's direction. The fine had eaten up his savings and put him in debt. The community service took up his weekends. His criminal record would follow him for years, but somehow he'd found a way to create something meaningful from his mistake. His phone buzzed again, another message from a student who'd heard him speak. "Thanks for being so honest about what happened. Made me think twice about doing stupid stuff for likes." James smiled slightly as he read it. He hadn't chosen to become this kind of influencer, but maybe it was the kind he needed to be.